Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in our last talk in the series, we talked about that night visit that Nicodemus made to see Jesus. In this talk, I would like to talk on John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist's influence over the nation was enormous. His influence was even greater than the rulers, priests, and the princes. If John had announced himself to be the Messiah and he raised a revolt against Rome, the common people and even priests would have supported him. However, John's attention was not fixed on being a world's conqueror. Instead, his eyes were fixed upon Christ. John noticed that the tide of popularity began to turn away from himself and towards Jesus. He saw the crowds that came to listen to him lessen, while the people flocked to see and to hear Jesus. Jesus' followers also increased daily, and many came to Jesus' disciples for baptism. Jesus did not baptize, but he sanctioned the administration of this ordinance to his disciples. The disciples of John looked with jealousy upon the growing popularity of Jesus, and they criticized his work. John's disciples began to dispute with Jesus' disciples in regard to the form of words that were proper to use at baptism, and even as to the right of Jesus' disciples to baptize at all. John's disciples came to John with their complaints, and through their words, Satan, he tried to tempt John. Satan knew that although John's mission was about to close, he might get him to hinder the work of Christ. If John had listened to Satan and expressed grief or disappointment at being superseded, he would have sown the seeds of dissension and would have encouraged envy and jealousy. This, of course, would have hurt the progress of the gospel. But did John do this? No. John, he dwelt in an atmosphere that was uncontaminated with selfishness and ambition, and was far above the feelings of jealousy. It was not that John did not have by nature the faults and the weaknesses that are common to all of us. The difference was that John had been converted. John had that born-again experience that we talked about in our talk on Nicodemus. John displayed no sympathy with his disgruntled disciples. Instead, he said this to them. And we find it in John chapter 3, verses 27 through 30. It says, "A man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. He that hath the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy therefore is fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease." End of quote. John's mission was not to attract men to himself, but to lift their thoughts higher and still higher until they would rest upon the Lamb of God. John felt a joy in the silence and obscurity, so that the eyes of all might be turned to the light of life, who was Jesus Christ. On the subject of baptism, Jesus was the Savior from sin, and this is what baptism symbolizes. Now, there was no need of arguing as to whether Christ's baptism or John's purified from sin. It was the grace of Christ that gave life to the soul. Apart from Jesus Christ, baptism, like any other service, was a worthless form. John was also not the only one who was watching Jesus. The priests and the rabbis, they were also watching Jesus. These leaders had been very jealous of John's influence with the people, and now they saw many leaving the synagogues and flocking to see Jesus. They were not willing to say what John was willing to say. He must increase, but I must decrease. They determined to put an end to this work that was drawing the people away from them. The priests and the rulers were involved in trying to actually create the division between Christ's disciples and John's. With a prophetic eye, Christ, he knew that John would end up having to give his own life. Wishing to avoid dissension, Christ, he quietly ceased his labors, and he withdrew to Galilee. While we are always to be loyal to the truth, we should try to avoid all that may lead to discord and misapprehension. For whenever these arise, the result is a loss of souls. We must be very careful to not fix our attention upon what is human instead of what is divine. None of the work of God is to bear the image and the superscription of man. Herod the Great, he divided his kingdom among his 3 sons. Herod Antipas was the one responsible for the imprisonment and the murder of John the Baptist. Herod Antipas, he ruled Galilee, and he built a city on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he named it Tiberias, after the Roman emperor. Jesus didn't have very much good to say about Herod Antipas. In fact, he called Antipas that fox. And we can read about that in the book of Luke, chapter 13, verses 31 and 32. It says, "The same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying unto him, Get thee out, and depart hence, for Herod will kill thee. And he said unto them, Go ye and tell that fox, Behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the 3rd day I shall be perfected." End quote. Herod Antipas, he was married to a princess whose father was king of an area in which had for its capital Petra. Now, Petra is found south of the Dead Sea. Trouble arose after Antipas made a visit to Rome. During his visit to Rome, he became infatuated with Herodias, who was his niece and already married to his half-brother. Herodias' husband's name was Philip. Now, when Antipas decided that he wanted to live with Herodias, he broke up 2 marriages, his own and his half-brother's. You probably know the story. John the Baptist, he reproved Antipas, telling him that he should put away Herodias. She, of course, was furious and insisted that Antipas arrest John. Now, there is a fortress that is east of the Dead Sea, which Herod the Great had built. It was here that John the Baptist was imprisoned. Herod was troubled because he believed that John was a prophet of God. He fully intended to set John at liberty, but he delayed this purpose because he feared Herodias. On King Herod Antipas's birthday, Herodias, she determined by stratagem to get rid of John the Baptist. All of the officers of state and the nobles of the court, they were in attendance. There was much feasting and drunkenness. Herodias' beautiful daughter, her name was Salome, was sent into the banqueting hall to dance for the entertainment of the guests. Now, it was not customary for the ladies of the court to appear at these festivities, and this was a flattering compliment that was paid to Herod when this royal daughter danced for the amusement of his guests. Herod Antipas, he was drunk on wine, and passion held sway in the great banqueting hall. Herod's reason, being dethroned by the wine, made him only to see the beautiful girl Salome dancing before him. The reveling guests and the banqueting table, sparkling wine and the flashing lights. In his drunken state, Herod recklessly promised to give to Salome whatever she might ask, even up to half of his kingdom. In his drunken state, he thought that this would exalt him before the great men of his realm. Salome, she made a really big mistake, and she asked her mother what she should ask for. Salome did not know of the thirst for revenge in her mother's heart, and she shrank from presenting the request. But the determination of Herodias prevailed. And we know Herodias asked for John the Baptist's head on a silver platter. Now, when this request was made, the riotous mirth ceased. There was an ominous silence that settled down upon the scene of revelry. If one of the guests had offered a word against the fulfillment of this promise, Antipas would gladly have spared the prophet. But all in the banqueting hall, they sat and they said nothing. Antipas gave the guests an opportunity to speak in the prisoner's behalf, but they all sat and they were silent. These were men who occupied high positions of trust in the nation, and upon them rested grave responsibilities. But each of them sat in silence. Each one had given themselves up to feasting and drunkenness, and their senses were benumbed and their consciences lay dormant. Their silence, it pronounced the sentence of death upon the prophet of God, and it was all to satisfy the revenge of a wicked woman. This story has been repeated throughout history. Often the life of the innocent has been sacrificed through the intemperance of those who should have been guardians of justice. Some have been drunk with the intoxicating cup. Some drunk with power, some drunk with the love of money and influence. Those who have jurisdiction over the lives of their fellow men should be held guilty of a crime when they yield to intemperance or the love of money and power over right doing. All who execute laws, they should themselves be law keepers. Yet in our world today, we see little of this in the powers that be. The rulers of our world are not acting in accordance to moral principle and do not have a true sense of justice. Herodias' victory was hollow, however. Her name became infamous and abhorred, and Herod was more tormented by remorse than he had been by the warnings of the prophet when he was alive. His sin was ever before him, and he was constantly seeking to find relief from the accusing of a guilty conscience. A few years after the death of John, the king of Petra, the father of Antipas's abandoned wife, waged war against Antipas in retaliation for what he had done to his daughter. The princess, Herod Antipas's first wife, had to actually flee to avoid being slain by her adulterous husband. The king of Petra succeeded in taking some of the territories of Antipas. Tiberius was dead at this time, but he had even become angry with Antipas for stirring up trouble among the eastern rulers by abandoning his rightful queen. He felt that it was Herod's job to keep the peace and not to enrage the other rulers. Eventually, Caligula ascended the throne and decided to make Herod Agrippa the king of Judea and Samaria. Now, this actually lowered Antipas's rank. Again, the prideful Herodias became jealous. One of her brothers had been made king, while Antipas had been lowered to a governor or a subordinate ruler. The wicked Herodias, who had her way in beheading John the Baptist, now wanted to have King Agrippa removed. She insisted that Antipas journey with her to Rome and to ask Caligula to make him king instead of Agrippa. However, Agrippa, who was Antipas's brother-in-law, learned of Herodias's agenda and sent letters to Rome. In the letters, Antipas was accused of treasonable activities. Caligula, he investigated the matter, and he decided to banish Antipas to Gaul, which is modern France. Antipas was broken in spirit. The wicked Herodias was also banished with him. Antipas's territory was added to that already controlled by Agrippa. Antipas and Herodias, they died, lonely, forsaken, and impoverished. Have you ever heard the saying that says, crime does not pay? Or, what a man sows, that shall he also reap? I believe that we should learn these lessons from history, and so that we don't repeat their mistakes. I hope that you have enjoyed this little talk. If you have, I would just encourage you to click on that subscribe button. I want to thank you for listening, and I'm wishing you God's blessings and a wonderful rest of your week.